Hello and good day, Prime Minister Trudeau. My name is Jeffrey Ort, and between 2017 and 2019, I was trafficked to your country, held, raped, mutilated, and detransitioned over that 2-year period. This is, in fact, the second time this has been done to me by the same people in your country. In this message, I'm going to tell you about the first time. My biological grandmother was named Wilhelmina Conrad. She was born in 1927 and claims that she was abused and tortured worse than I was for the entirety of her childhood, only escaping when she married my grandfather. Her first daughter was Karen. She was born in 1946. She is my biological mother. Wilhelmina raised Karen the way Wilhelmina was raised. Karen was tortured, claiming that she was physically and sexually abused worse than I was for the entirety of her childhood, claiming that she was starved and beaten and forced to do housework and look after her mother. And then the same tortures were done to force her to look after her brother, who was born in 1953. And then the same tortures were done to her to force her to look after her sister, who was born in 1960. Karen's own obituary states that she left Beach Meadows. She escaped this abuse when she finished high school in 1964 and moved to Ontario. She married my father and had 4 children. I'm the second of the 4, born in 1973. Roseanne was left alone to be raised by Wilhelmina in the same fashion, and she claims that she was physically and sexually abused worse than I was as a child and forced to do her mother's housework and look after her mother. The importance of this is the age differences. None of these women have ever been together as adults. It has always been one adult torturing one child. In 1980, that all changed. In 1980, when I was 7 years old, my family was split in half by divorce. Karen returned to Beach Meadows with 4 children under 9, largely because her brother gave her a house and her brother gave her a car. She had no education, no money, no prospects. Our family doctor at that time was Morash. My family was split in half again due to the violence of those 3 women being together as adults for the first time ever. They went to war with each other over who had to look after Wilhelmina and who had to do Wilhelmina's housework, and it all ended in my siblings and I being beaten. Savagely, savagely beaten. Within only a couple of months of Karen being in Beach Meadows, Erland Conrad grew so concerned that these 3 women would kill 1 or more of his grandchildren that he took 2 of them away. That's how my family got split in half a second time. Wilhelmina was given her 2 daughters. Karen and Roseanne had to help with her housework and had to help look after her. Roseanne was given the 2 youngest children as an excuse to not wait on her mother hand and foot every day and as punishment for participating in the beating of these children. Karen was given the 2 oldest children. And again, it was her excuse. She had to help her mother, but she had children to raise, and that was her excuse to not be there every single day. This only made the situation worse. There weren't 4 children to beat. There were only 2, and I took the brunt of it. A month after my siblings were sent to live with Roseanne, I was beaten into concussive and post-concussive trauma so severe that my hypothalamus was destroyed, my pituitary gland was damaged, and there was unknown amounts of damage done to other structures and neurological pathways. The immediate and most profound effect of losing your hypothalamus is the shutting down of all of the metabolic systems that I've listed here. You can find them on Wikipedia if you want. I lost the ability to maintain body temperature, to heat or cool myself. I lost the ability to pant or sweat properly. My sweat turned into an oil that smelled like garbage. I couldn't regulate hunger or thirst, so I had constant cycles of high blood sugar, low blood sugar, and dehydration. This caused intense bouts of diarrhea and constipation, which has damaged my digestive system. I don't recognize or react to fatigue or sleep cycles appropriately. I can't maintain normal or routine circadian rhythms. There's been damage to my heart and blood vessels. There's damage to my entire gastrointestinal system. There are innumerable bowel issues. All of these combined over an 11-year period when I was prevented from seeing or speaking to medical professionals, resulted in 3 terminal medical conditions that are not connected to my gender issues. A consequence of losing your hypothalamus and pituitary gland is you lose all of your androgen systems, you lose all of your gonadotropins, you lose all of your sexual differentiation. You can't produce or process or eliminate any of the drugs or hormones or chemicals related to any growth and development. But more profound to my family, or at least my grandfather, is that this beating took place one time on one day and resulted in a behavioral shift so substantial that he could only describe it as his grandson died in his kitchen and something else woke up. My grandfather's deathbed confession is that I wasn't his grandson anymore, not after I woke up from that beating. That behavioral shift also resulted in a personality change, in which I lost the ability to protect or defend myself. I lost the ability to beg for my life. And in most instances, I lost the ability to speak in the first person. This coincided with me being given to men in the community to be raped. The 3 women that did all of this damage to my body and my life learned over the course of a month that I could no longer be beaten into doing anything. I could no longer be threatened into doing anything. So they had me raped by men in the community so they could threaten me with having my siblings raped by those same men if I didn't do what they told me to. I was never allowed to speak to doctors. I was never allowed to speak to teachers. I was never allowed to tell anyone what was happening to me. Because I could not process or eliminate any form of androgen or gonadotropin, my body accumulated estrogen and estrogen mimics from my diet. This resulted in a precocious hyperfemale hormone profile. My body thought it was female and many years older than I actually was. This resulted in precocious hyperized puberty between the ages of 8 or 9 when I developed the secondary sexual characteristics of a girl who would be much older. All of this was hidden from doctors and the medical community, under the threat that if I ever told anyone that I was sick or that I wasn't being taken to a doctor, my siblings would be raped and mutilated the way I was. By the age of 10, I was routinely introduced by non-family members as a girl, as a female, as one of my grandfather's granddaughters. The age differences between my siblings and the structure of the school system at the time meant that we were never together in a group, and people that didn't know the family well couldn't tell us apart. By the age of 12, I was simply accepted as one of the granddaughters, and that my grandfather and I, working independently from each other, we both managed to end the penetrative rape that I was being subjected to, which only enraged my aunt and my mother and my grandmother because they had lost their ability to threaten me. For 11 years, unable to contact or tell doctors about being sick or being mistreated, I was forced to live in a male body with a hyper-female hormone profile. It is indescribably painful. With the stopping of the penetrative rape, my aunt and my mother and my grandmother switched to more severe emotional and financial abuse. With the exception of going to high school or working in the community, I was not allowed to leave Beach Meadows. I wasn't allowed to leave this tiny community. I wasn't allowed to see anyone so that no one could see what was wrong with me. I was subjected to even more severe physical and sexual mutilations via starvation and the lack of basic necessities, as well as the lack of access to medical treatment. Through a combination of beatings and rapes, my genitals were mutilated and chemically amputated and partially physically amputated from my skeletal system. I was in intense and indescribable physical pain for 11 years. In 1991, I finished high school and went to St. Anne's University to learn French. This was the first time the outside world had ever seen me, and they did not react well. The assaults that I sustained over that year and a half would be described. I don't know how the outside world would describe them. To me, it was a walk in the park compared to my childhood. But what happened to me at St. Anne's, what the community saw, what the faculty and administrators saw, upset and concerned them enough that they fabricated a contract for me to sign. In April of 1992, a small group of faculty and administrators made me sign a document promising that I would see a doctor, and if I didn't, they wouldn't release my transcripts and I wouldn't be allowed to go to university. This small school forced me to see a doctor, and the only doctor I knew was Gary Morash. So in April of 1992, I returned to Beach Meadows. I went to Gary Morash behind the backs of all of my rapists. I didn't tell them what I was doing. I told him what the school had done. I told him what I thought was wrong with me, and I didn't tell him anything about what I had hidden from him for 11 years. Dr. Morash tested me for what I thought was wrong. He tested me for what he thought was wrong, and I failed everything. So he sent me to John Grantmire. Dr. Grantmire was a urologist in Halifax, and I went to see him in June or July of 1992. Unfortunately, my rapists found out before I got to see Dr. Grantmire, and I was threatened day in and day out for 3 months with the rape and mutilation of my younger brother and younger sister if I didn't take one of my rapists to my medical appointments. I didn't have a choice. I had promised the school that I would go, and I was being threatened with the rape and mutilation of my siblings if I told Dr. Grantmire too much. So I took my rapist to my medical appointment with me. I never lied to Dr. Grantmire, but I wasn't allowed to tell him everything. I wasn't allowed to volunteer information that I thought was important. And as a result, I was misdiagnosed and prescribed incorrect medication. I was given what Dr. Grantmire considered a whiff of testosterone. He believed that I had an epically rare hypo, meaning low, gonadotropic issue, meaning there was some problem with my hypothalamus and my pituitary gland. He had said that a small amount of testosterone for the rest of my life would sort everything out, and I would be fine. He didn't test me to find out that I needed blockers. He didn't test me to find out that I needed medications or supplements for the escalating and widespread organ failure, and I didn't know to tell him. Nothing about my body had changed. I couldn't process or eliminate the testosterone that I was being given. So I maintained a hyper-female profile and was forced through puberty, losing more teeth again, developing a hyper-male hormone profile alongside the hyper-female hormone profile. I now had both genders ripping me apart. And that is exponentially more painful than having one of them in there. There were some health benefits. I had increased bone mass and increased muscle mass. I grew from 5'6" to 6 foot. I dropped from over 300 pounds to 200 or less. And that is a resting metabolism. I did not work out. I did not play sports. I did not do anything that would draw attention to me. And I did not do anything that I even remotely suspected would require that I pass a drug test. Because I would never be able to pass a drug test. Dr. Grantmire considered my condition so rare and so important as a teaching tool that he asked me to return to Dalhousie University as a teaching aide for someone that student doctors would interview once or twice a year, and I did this until 94 or 95. I never lied to any of these student doctors. I never lied to Dr. Grantmire. I answered the questions that I was asked, and I obfuscated or avoided any reference to how this might have happened to me as a child. Dr. Grantmire grew suspicious of something. He never told me what he thought, but sometime in 94 or 95, Dr. Grantmire sent a letter to Dr. Morash requesting that I be given intense counseling and therapy as I was concealing something as well as not adjusting as well or as quickly as he thought I should. Unfortunately, Dr. Grantmire didn't tell me he was doing that. My rapists found out first, and my siblings were threatened with rape and mutilation if I carried through with any of this. I was ordered by my rapists never to see Dr. Grantmire again, which I never did, and I was ordered never to attend counseling or therapy. I was ordered never to tell anyone anything. And as a result, I was forced to live in even more physical pain, with both gender profiles tearing me apart for another 12 years. I finished university at the Agricultural College in '97, and to avoid a repeat of a doctor growing suspicious over time, I insisted on seeing a different or new doctor every 3 weeks. Officially, my family doctor was named Weisgerber out of Prince George, but I made a point of not telling him anything and avoiding seeing him as often as I could so that he would not grow suspicious. My lifestyle at the time, I was living in a car, I was planting trees, I was making my living with a power saw, allowed me to travel extensively in Canada and the US, which allowed me to see a different doctor every 3 weeks. For this 12-year period, from 1992 to 2004, I had hypergender hormone profiles for both male and female active in my body and tearing me apart. There were some health improvements, but all of it caused an escalating accumulation of deformities and disabilities in my terminal medical issues, my organ failure issues, and my other metabolic issues. I was simply being crippled faster than ever. I lost the ability to do manual labor in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, I'd lost the ability to do manual labor to make my living, to pay for my medical treatments, to pay for the travel that I was using to hide my medical treatments. I tried to scratch out a living by doing more paramedic work, but the idea of my health being the benchmark for the safety of other people's health, I couldn't agree to do that. I couldn't be relied upon to be able to perform the duties of a paramedic in a catastrophic situation. So yeah, it didn't work out. I spent the winter of 2003 looking for options. I learned through my research that Seoul, specifically South Korea in general, was the center of the universe for medical tourism. So I got the first job I could that was anywhere close to Seoul. I started that job in either late January or early February in 2004, and a man that I had never met, who gave me an apartment and gave me a plane ticket and gave me an envelope full of cash just because I said I would work for him for a year. I took that money the first weekend I was in Seoul and went directly to the International Clinic in Itaewon because it had the largest American military presence. And I had correctly guessed that the doctors at that international clinic would be American or military trained. I met Dr. Kim. I explained, without going into the details of how my injuries were accumulated, I explained the medical treatments that I had been through and what the consequences of those medical treatments had been. Dr. Kim listened, and this is not a story about Far East magical medical mysticism. This is simply 25 years of science improvements and medical improvements, and Dr. Kim was used to people traveling from around the world with very rare or weird conditions to be dealt with. He tested me more extensively than any doctor had in the past, and he's the one that figured everything out. He's the one that learned that my hypothalamus had essentially been destroyed, that I had the severe damage to my pituitary and other structures and other neural pathways. He's the one that figured out that, broadly speaking, I have 3 terminal medical issues, although if you start splitting hairs on this organ and that organ, you can pick any number you want. But he's the one that found the medications and the supplements. They didn't fix the issues, they just slowed down how fast they were killing me. He's the one that ran the hormone profile tests that determined that I had both active genders going on. He's the one who succinctly told me, you're both genders. You need to pick one, because having both of them is killing you faster than having one of them. He's also the person who told me, simply and bluntly, you need to pick how you're going to look for the rest of your life. I decided on what I currently look like, more or less, because I felt it would be easier for family and friends in the world. Dr. Kim is the one that prescribed blockers to remove the female profile, and Dr. Kim and I experimented with testosterone cocktails until we found one that worked. One of the side effects of the wrong testosterone isn't worth describing. We settled on a very expensive Bayer product that I had to short cycle, which means I take the maximum dosage at the minimum interval in order to avoid those side effects, which means instead of having to have an injection every 3 weeks, I now have an injection every 2 months. I have to take blockers every day and I have to take medications every day, but the actual super expensive injection in your rear end, I only have to do that every 2 months. And over the course of that year and a half, I grew into being the happiest and healthiest that I will ever be in my life. It isn't a fraction of the happiness or health that a normal person lives with. I still live with extreme pain. It's just not as bad as it used to be. And I got to be my version of happy and healthy for 12 years. I was my version of normal, my version of happy, my version of healthy from 2004 until 2017. There were a couple of wrinkles along the way. Only 2 of them are relevant to my abduction in 2017. In 2010, I learned that my rapists were grooming a woman from my past out of their fear that I was going to return to Canada and try to build a life with her. They have known for a very long time that if I ever return to Canada, if I ever seek medical treatments in Canada, that they will all go to prison because I won't be able to hide where those injuries came from. Not anymore, they're too serious. So in 2010, I finished work in South Korea. I flew to Ottawa where I was staying with my uncle. He was aware that I was traveling with about $15,000 in medication. He didn't ask what it was for, but I was there to do a Saudi work permit. And when the Saudi work permit was complete and I had to pick a flight, that's when I found out that my childhood rapists were sticking their claws into someone from my past. And while my life with that person did not work out, I still felt obligated to protect her from them. So I flew to Halifax, Nova Scotia. I changed my flights so that I would fly from Halifax to Saudi Arabia. I rented a car, I drove to Beach Meadows, and I confronted Karen and Roseanne. And I am a simple and blunt person, and I told them everything. Everything about my health, everything about my medications, everything about the death of my son, and why that meant I couldn't build a life with this person. And I warned them. I'm going overseas. It's my intention to stay overseas. This person is one of the reasons I would come back to Canada. If you don't leave them alone, I will come home and make a point of putting you in prison. So leave that person alone, stay out of my life, and leave me be overseas. And I flew to Saudi Arabia. And I got to live happily and healthily for a few more years. In 2015, I was finishing up work in China. I flew into Halifax to process another work permit for Saudi Arabia. I had an unfortunate lung infection from the pollution in China, and it took a little bit longer. Over the course of me waiting for that to clear up, I learned that it would be Erling Conrad's last summer. I didn't know how or why. I was simply told by my sister that it would be Erling's last summer. Would I please come to Beach Meadows to see him? So I was living in Halifax at the time. I gave up my apartment. I returned to Beach Meadows in April of 2015 to care for Erling Conrad for the next 4 months. I didn't have to deal with Roseanne. She wasn't there. She had run away. She was hiding at the cottage in Greenfield. I never saw her that summer. And I want this point to be very clear. I never saw her that summer. Her father was dying. His life could end at any day, and she wouldn't come visit him for those 4 months because those 3 women were tearing each other apart again. They probably actually had never stopped. But Karen also wasn't there. I didn't have to deal with her. She was at the height of a raging fentanyl addiction. She was on a transdermal patch for the maximum dosage that existed. The only thing she could do was drool and burn herself with cigarettes. So that's two of the most violent of my rapists that I don't have to deal with. I had to contend with Wilhelmina every day. In 1993, she had thrown me out of Beach Meadows and told me that I was never allowed to return. She was not happy that I was there. She was not happy that I was helping look after Erlen. The war between Wilhelmina and her daughters spilled over into abusing Erlen Conrad. And my presence and his abuse triggered Erlen on a regular basis. I took Erlen's deathbed confession more than a dozen times over the 4 months that I lived in Beach Meadows and looked after him before flying to Saudi Arabia again for work in August of 2015. And this is more or less the end of what, Prime Minister Trudeau, you would need to know about my past to know how these three women did what they did in 2017.